December 8, 1941. Aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, cold waves of the North Pacific crashed softly against the steel hull as the massive ship steamed homeward toward Japan. Behind it, far across the dark ocean, smoke still curled above the ruins of Pearl Harbor, the base that had just been struck with shocking precision and fury. Inside the carrier, the atmosphere was electric. Pilots crowded the narrow corridors, their flight suits still reeking of oil and exhaust, voices raised in laughter and disbelief. They spoke of flaming battleships, exploding fuel tanks, and the blinding chaos they had unleashed upon the Americans. Bottles were opened, toasts were shouted, men embraced as if history itself had been rewritten in their favor. To them, Japan had just won the greatest naval victory the world had ever seen. But in a quiet corner of the operations room, one man sat apart. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor air assault, wasn't celebrating. He sat hunched over a small desk, a single lamp illuminating his notes. In his hand, a pencil trembled slightly as he scribbled figures across a sheet of paper. His face was pale, his eyes distant. The numbers in front of him told a story, one that none of the cheering men around him wanted to hear. A story of doom hidden beneath triumph. As he calculated, Genda realized something that made his stomach turn cold. The very success they were celebrating had doomed Japan to eventual defeat. The attack had been flawless in execution, 8 American battleships sunk or damaged, over 2,000 men killed, the Pacific Fleet crippled, but strategically, it had been a catastrophic mistake. And Genda knew exactly why. The math was brutal and undeniable. Japan had awakened a giant, a nation with resources so vast that no tactical brilliance could overcome them. Once fully mobilized, the United States possessed the industrial capacity to crush Japan completely, and Genda's rough projections suggested it could happen in as little as 4 years. He stared at the numbers again, silently rechecking them, hoping he was wrong. He was. This was December 8, 1941, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the day one Japanese officer sat alone among the victors and understood the terrible truth. Japan had already lost the war. To understand Genda's realization, one must understand the desperate situation Japan faced in that winter of 1941. For 4 long years, Japan had been mired in a brutal war in China, a conflict that drained men, fuel, and steel without end. Cities had fallen, millions had died, yet China refused to surrender. The empire's armies were bogged down in endless occupation and guerrilla warfare. The war was devouring Japan's economy. But the true weakness wasn't military, it was industrial. Japan was an island nation poor in natural resources. It had almost no domestic oil production, no rubber, and only limited capacity for steel. Every essential resource, oil, iron, fuel, had to be imported, and those resources were controlled by 3 powers, the United States, Britain, and the Dutch East Indies. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina, the United States responded with an oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch soon joined. Practically overnight, Japan's oil imports fell to near zero. Japanese planners ran the numbers. Their reserves would last 18 months at most. After that, the Navy's ships would be silent, the army immobilized, and the empire paralyzed. Japan faced 2 choices. It could withdraw from China, negotiate peace, and restore trade, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force. The military chose force. But there was a problem. Any attack on the Dutch East Indies would almost certainly bring Britain, and possibly the United States, into the war. The U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was the greatest immediate threat. If it remained intact, Japan's southern campaign could be strangled before it began. So the planners decided on a bold solution, a preemptive strike. Destroy the Pacific Fleet in one decisive blow, gain a year of freedom in the Pacific, seize the oil fields, and fortify an island perimeter that the Americans would find too costly to penetrate. If the United States bled enough, perhaps it would agree to negotiate, leaving Japan's new empire intact. It was a desperate gamble, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, knew it. He had studied in America, visited its factories, and understood its scale. He had warned the government, Japan could dominate the Pacific for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. It wasn't pessimism, it was mathematics. The United States could build ships faster than Japan could sink them. Yet the decision for war was made, and Yamamoto's duty was clear, to make the strike as devastating as possible. For that, he turned to Minoru Genda. Genda, the young and brilliant air tactician, threw himself into the work. He studied every known air raid in modern history, especially Britain's attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto, and applied its lessons to Pearl Harbor. He analyzed the harbor's depth, weather patterns, and defenses. He designed torpedoes that could run in shallow water and selected the perfect balance of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. The result was a tactical masterpiece. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers launched 2 waves of aircraft totaling 350 planes. The attack achieved complete surprise. Within minutes, the battleship Arizona exploded in a fireball, Oklahoma capsized, California and West Virginia sank at their moorings. In less than 2 hours, the pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay shattered. Japanese losses were minimal: 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, fewer than 100 men. The operation was a stunning success. But as the Akagi turned homeward through the dark Pacific, while the men rejoiced, Genda sat silently at his desk, doing the one thing no one else dared to do. He calculated what came next. And the numbers, he knew, foretold disaster. Commander Minoru Genda stared down at his calculations, the quiet hum of the carrier's engines filling the air around him. Every digit on the page seemed to cut deeper into his thoughts. The arithmetic was not complex. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of math that could end empires. He began with what he knew. In 1941, the United States had produced nearly 5 million automobiles, cars that rolled off assembly lines with a speed and efficiency unmatched anywhere in the world. Japan had produced fewer than 50,000. That single comparison revealed everything about the two nations' industrial worlds. America's economy was built on mass production. Japan's was built on scarcity and sacrifice. Steel told the same story. The United States produced roughly 75 million tons of steel each year. Japan barely reached 7 million. Oil, America pumped more than 1.4 billion barrels annually from its own soil. Japan produced almost nothing domestically, and now, after the embargo, had to rely on seizing what little it could from the Dutch East Indies, perhaps 50 million barrels a year, if everything went perfectly. Those weren't just numbers, they were the measure of capacity. Capacity to build ships. Capacity to forge tanks, guns, aircraft, and bombs. Capacity to wage an industrial war, the kind of war Japan had just started but could never sustain. Genda pressed the pencil tip into the paper until it snapped. Around him, laughter still echoed from the pilots' quarters, men bragging about how the Americans would never recover, how Japan's empire would now stretch from China to Hawaii. But Genda knew better. He could already see the shape of the war ahead, a war of attrition that Japan could not possibly win. He ran the calculations again. The numbers told a merciless story. Even if the United States lost every battleship at Pearl Harbor, it could replace them all within 18 months. Most weren't even total losses. They sat in shallow water. He knew the Americans would salvage, repair, and return them to service. Aircraft. America was already producing over 19,000 military planes per year, compared to Japan's 5,000. At that rate, the aircraft destroyed at Pearl Harbor could be replaced in less than a month. But the real danger, Genda realized, wasn't in replacing what had been lost. It was in building what had not yet existed. He remembered Yamamoto's warning that Japan could run wild for 6 months. Now Genda understood precisely what that meant. America's shipyards and factories, once mobilized, would unleash a torrent of production unlike anything in history. In 1941, the U.S. Navy had 7 aircraft carriers. By the end of the war, Genda calculated they could have close to 100. In 1941, the U.S. Navy possessed about 350 warships of all types. By 1945, he estimated it could exceed 6,000. Japan, by comparison, had 10 carriers and roughly the same total number of warships, and lacked the steel, the workers, and the infrastructure to expand that number meaningfully. For every ship Japan built, America could build 5. For every pilot Japan trained, America could train 3. And those American pilots would fly more, shoot more, and learn faster, because America had the fuel and ammunition to train them properly. By Genda's projections, by late 1943, just 2 years after Pearl Harbor, the balance would tilt irreversibly. Japan's naval and air forces would begin to shrink with every battle, while America's would expand. Every carrier sunk, every veteran pilot lost, would be an irreplaceable blow. The math of attrition, cold, heartless, mathematical, favored the United States absolutely. Then there was geography. Japan's new defensive perimeter stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific, from the Solomon Islands to the Dutch East Indies, from the Marshalls to Burma. Defending that empire meant spreading forces thinly across countless islands and bases. The Americans, by contrast, could strike wherever they chose, concentrating overwhelming power at one point after another. Genda understood that the very strategy Japan had adopted, forcing America to fight for each island, would ensure defeat. Every glorious defense would bleed Japan dry, while America, backed by endless factories and raw materials, could absorb every loss and return stronger. His fellow officers, when he quietly voiced his fears, dismissed him as too cautious. They believed in spirit, in the Bushido ideal that courage and sacrifice could outweigh numbers. They spoke of the softness of Americans, claiming that once faced with high casualties, they would lose the will to fight. Genda knew that was delusion. He had studied America's history, a nation that had fought a civil war, killing over 600,000 of its own people, would not surrender easily. A nation that had crossed an ocean to fight in World War I would not shrink from another. Worse still, Pearl Harbor itself had united them. The surprise attack, carried out while diplomats still negotiated in Washington, had enraged the American public beyond measure. In his mind, Genda could already hear Roosevelt's voice, a date which will live in infamy. The attack had done what no act of diplomacy or propaganda could. It had fused the American nation into one purpose: vengeance. Every line of calculation, every ratio, every probability Genda wrote led to the same conclusion. Pearl Harbor was a tactical triumph, but a strategic catastrophe. Japan had bought 6 months of freedom at the cost of ensuring its own destruction. The arithmetic was merciless. The outcome inevitable. He folded his paper, placed it carefully into his notebook, and stared out across the dark sea. Somewhere out there, the United States, vast, angry, and awakening, was preparing to answer. Washington, D.C., December 8, 1941. The morning after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Capitol was unrecognizable. The air was sharp and electric, as if the entire city were holding its breath. Soldiers guarded every corner of the War Department. Messengers ran through corridors with telegrams from Hawaii, Manila, and Wake Island. Radios in homes, taxis, and diners played the same grave voice, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressing a nation that had been struck but not broken. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. In that moment, the anger of 130 million people focused into a single point. Factories that had been building cars began to retool for tanks. Shipyards that had built freighters were now ordered to produce destroyers, cruisers, and carriers. Across the Midwest, Plants in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago went from making washing machines and engines to building aircraft fuselages and machine guns. The sleeping giant, as Yamamoto himself would later call it, had awakened. And it was not merely waking in fury, it was waking in organization. Within weeks, the US Congress approved the largest war mobilization budget in history. Within months, production targets had quadrupled. By the end of 1942, new shipyards lined both coasts. By 1943, America was launching a new aircraft carrier every few weeks and a new Liberty ship every single day. The numbers that haunted Commander Genda's mind were now taking shape in steel and flame. Pearl Harbor's reborn. Even as Japan celebrated, the Americans were already salvaging. Divers worked tirelessly in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, patching hulls, pumping out fuel, and raising ships from the mud. By March 1942, most of the damaged battleships were afloat again. The West Virginia, California, and Nevada would all fight again before the war was over. The Japanese had sunk ships, but not the fleet. And crucially, the American aircraft carriers, the true capital ships of modern warfare, had been at sea during the attack. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were untouched. It was pure accident, but that accident would change the course of the entire war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, newly appointed to command the Pacific Fleet, understood immediately that the age of battleships was over. Pearl Harbor didn't just destroy ships, he said later, it destroyed illusions. From that moment forward, the Pacific War would be fought and won by air power. Across the Pacific. Meanwhile, Japan expanded rapidly. Within months, its forces swept across the Pacific, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, each falling with shocking speed. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. Newspapers across the world printed maps shaded darker every week, showing the empire's reach stretching across half the ocean. But each conquest came with a cost. Every captured island required garrisons, supplies, and fuel, none of which Japan could replace quickly. The further they advanced, the longer their supply lines stretched, and the more fragile their victories became. American submarines began striking at those supply lines. Silent, unseen, they sank hundreds of Japanese transports carrying oil, rubber, and food, the very lifeblood of the empire. Within a year, Japan's merchant fleet was bleeding to death beneath the waves. At the same time, American codebreakers in a small, windowless office in Hawaii, known as Station Hypo, were deciphering Japanese naval messages. Their work would soon give the US Navy an advantage no amount of courage could match. The turning tide. In early 1942, in a conference room deep within the White House, Roosevelt met with his military chiefs. The question was simple but monumental: how do we strike back? General George Marshall argued for Europe first. Germany remains the greater threat. But Roosevelt understood the American public's fury. The Pacific could not wait. The answer came in the form of a daring plan, the Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers took off from the deck of the carrier USS Hornet, flying straight toward Tokyo. The raid did little physical damage, but psychologically, it was seismic. For the first time in history, American bombers struck the Japanese capital. Civilians saw explosions in their own streets. The illusion of Japan's invulnerability shattered overnight. Back aboard the Akagi, Commander Genda received the report in silence. The Doolittle Raid, though small, confirmed his darkest fears. America was already striking back, sooner and more aggressively than anyone had imagined. He looked at the map of the Pacific pinned on the wall. The empire Japan had built in mere months was surrounded by an enemy growing stronger every day. The Japanese fleet, still triumphant in name, was burning through fuel faster than it could be replaced. Their pilots, some of the finest in the world, were dying faster than new ones could be trained. In the Imperial Navy's high command, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto began to understand the same thing Genda had realized that first night aboard the Akagi. They had awakened a nation with the power to turn industry into vengeance. Yamamoto's next move would aim to crush America's remaining carriers in one decisive battle, a gamble that would decide the fate of the Pacific. That battle would take place on a small, remote atoll called Midway.